The night of the 23rd of December, 1942, hung over northern Germany like a shroud woven from ice and darkness. Squadron leader James Ward peered through the frost-crusted windscreen of Wellington bomber, or for Robert, as it droned toward the industrial heart of Munster. Its twin Bristol Pegasus engines hammering a steady rhythm against the winter silence. Below, the scattered lights of villages blinked like dying embers, oblivious to the 53 aircraft of No. 75 Squadron spreading across the moonless sky. Ward flexed his gloved fingers around the control column, feeling the bomber shudder as frigid air rushed past its geodetic framework, that revolutionary lattice of metal strips that designer Barnes Wallis had promised would keep a Wellington flying even when conventional aircraft would tumble from the heavens. The wireless operator, Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, hunched over his equipment in the fuselage, tapping out position reports with methodical precision. His breath formed white clouds in the unheated cabin, where temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Behind him, the rear gunner, Flight Sergeant David Cooper, rotated his turret restlessly, scanning the darkness for the shadow shapes of Messerschmitt night fighters that haunted these skies like mechanical wolves. Every man aboard or for Robert understood the mathematics of survival. Bomber Command had lost 1,404 aircraft in 1942 alone, their crews scattered across the European countryside in fragments of aluminum and bone. Tonight would add more names to that grim ledger, though none yet knew whose names would be inscribed. At 11:47 in the evening, the formation approached the initial point for their bombing run. Anti-aircraft searchlights suddenly erupted from the darkness below, their brilliant beams stabbing upward to form a cage of light above Munster. Flak batteries opened fire seconds later, pumping 88mm shells into the bomber stream with metronomic fury. Ward threw R4 Robert into a weaving pattern, feeling the aircraft buck and shudder as shrapnel sleeted past. Bomb aimer pilot officer Richard Hayes lay prone in the nose, calling corrections as the target indicators bloomed over the marshalling yard's green and red cascades of pyrotechnic fury that marked where their bombs should fall. The Wellington lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of high explosive tumbled from its belly, momentarily relieved of its burden before Ward banked hard for home. They had penetrated 30 miles into German-held territory when Cooper's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with controlled fear. Fighter, 6 o'clock high. The Messerschmitt 110 materialized from the void like a predator emerging from deep water, its twin engines howling as it closed the distance. Tracer rounds laced the darkness, brilliant orange threads stitching to Ward or for Robert with terrible inevitability. Ward threw the Wellington into a diving turn, but the night fighter pilot anticipated the maneuver, his cannon shells finding their mark with devastating precision. The fuselage erupted in a cacophony of tearing metal and shattering perspex as 20mm rounds punched through the bomber's skin, each impact sending vibrations through the airframe that Ward felt in his teeth. The first shell struck for Robert's port wing at 11:53, rupturing fuel lines and shredding the fabric covering that stretched over Wallis's geodetic framework. Ward felt the control column jerk in his hands as hydraulic pressure dropped precipitously. The bomber yawing left with sickening momentum. Behind him, Navigator Flight Lieutenant Edward Barnes braced against his chart table as the aircraft shuddered. His carefully plotted course home suddenly becoming theoretical as the Wellington transformed from precision instrument into wounded beast. The Messerschmitt pilot, sensing vulnerability, pressed his attack with methodical aggression, walking his fire from wing root to tail assembly. Each cannon strike produced a distinct sound, a sharp crack followed by the whistle of wind through torn metal that combined into a symphony of mechanical agony. Cooper returned fire from his rear turret, his 4 Browning machine guns chattering defiance, even as tracer rounds passed within inches of his position. The night fighter broke away momentarily, its pilot likely reassessing this unexpectedly resilient prey. In that brief respite, Mitchell abandoned his wireless set to assess damage, crawling aft through the fuselage where moonlight now streamed through dozens of holes. What he discovered defied immediate comprehension. The Wellington's interior resembled a metal colander, punctured by shell impacts that had miraculously missed every crewman aboard. One round had passed through the floor directly beneath Barnes's position, exited through the ceiling, and continued into the night without touching human flesh. Another had severed the intercom cable to the tail position, leaving Cooper isolated but alive. According to documentation later preserved in Air Ministry archives and referenced in the Royal Air Force Museum's collection of Bomber Command records, the German pilot executed 3 separate attack runs over the next 12 minutes. Each pass added fresh wounds to our four Roberts' accumulating damage, yet the Wellington remained stubbornly airborne. The geodetic construction that had seemed merely innovative during peacetime training now revealed its genius. Under combat conditions, even when dozens of structural members suffered damage, the load redistributed across the remaining lattice, preventing catastrophic failure. Ward discovered this principle experientially as he fought to maintain altitude, feeling the aircraft respond to his inputs despite control surfaces that had been partially shot away. The Messerschmitt pilot's fourth approach proved nearly fatal. He closed to point-blank range, his cannon fire raking R for Robert, from nose to tail in a sustained burst that lasted for seconds, an eternity measured in heartbeats and terror. The starboard engine erupted in flames that streamed backward like a hellish banner, while the bomb bay doors, already damaged, tore completely free and tumbled into the darkness below. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the windscreen, instantly freezing into an opaque sheet that reduced forward visibility to nothing. Ward, operating entirely on instruments now, feathered the burning engine and activated the fire suppression system. For 30 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then the flames sputtered and died, leaving only the acrid stench of burned oil and the single port engines straining to maintain their altitude at 8,000 feet. The night fighter circled once more, its pilot presumably surveying his handiwork and calculating whether additional ammunition expenditure was necessary. Whatever calculus he employed, he concluded that R for Robert was finished, a reasonable assessment given that the Wellington now trailed smoke, flew on one engine, and displayed the aerodynamic characteristics of a mortally wounded bird. The Messerschmitt waggled its wings once, a gesture of professional respect between warriors, then peeled away toward easier prey elsewhere in the bomber stream. Ward permitted himself one shaking breath before addressing his crew over the damaged intercom system. Damage report, all positions. The responses that filtered back to Ward painted a portrait of destruction that should have been incompatible with continued flight. Barnes reported his navigation station partially destroyed, his maps shredded by shrapnel, and his compass spinning uselessly from magnetic interference caused by shell fragments lodged in the airframe. Hayes, having returned from the bomb aimer's position, discovered his parachute pack punctured in 3 places, rendering it worthless. Mitchell's wireless set had taken a direct hit, severing all communication with headquarters at Newmarket. The Squadron 75 base in Suffolk would have no knowledge of their survival or predicament until they either returned or failed to return. Cooper, isolated in his tail turret without intercom, continued his vigil in solitude, unaware that his crewmates yet lived. Ward executed a mental calculation that had become grimly familiar to bomber pilots. Distance to friendly territory versus fuel remaining versus altitude available for gliding if the remaining engine failed. The numbers offered little comfort. Munster lay 180 miles from the Dutch coast, which itself remained under German occupation. Another 120 miles of North Sea stretched beyond, frigid water that granted survival times measured in minutes for men in flight gear. Their single functioning engine consumed fuel at a rate that might, optimistically, carry them to the English Channel, where they could ditch and hope for rescue by air-sea rescue launches that patrolled those waters. Might and hope currencies of dubious value when traded against the certainty of physics and mechanical failure. At 12:17 in the morning of December 24th, Ward made his decision. They would not ditch. They would not divert to the closer but heavily defended airfields of occupied Holland. They would fly our 4 Robert home to Newmarket, regardless of fuel state or aircraft condition, because Wellington crews did not abandon their aircraft, while engines still turned and wings still generated lift. This decision, born of equal parts determination and desperation, transformed the next 2 hours into a masterclass of airmanship executed under conditions that would have justified surrender. Ward trimmed the aircraft obsessively, adjusting elevator and rudder to minimize drag from the damaged airframe, coaxing every possible mile from their dwindling fuel. Barnes, working by flashlight amid the wreckage of his station, attempted dead reckoning navigation using a pencil, the back of a damaged map, and his wristwatch. Without radio navigation, aids, or functioning instruments. He reverted to techniques that would have been familiar to maritime navigators of the previous century. Estimated wind speed based on ground speed calculations, assumed drift based on prevailing weather patterns, and desperate hope that his mathematics approached reality. Every 15 minutes he crawled forward towards position and penciled a new heading on a scrap of paper, each course correction representing his best guess at where England might be found in the darkness ahead. The Wellington droned westward, alone now, separated from the bomber stream and invisible to friend and foe alike. They crossed the Dutch coast at 12:41, Ward confirming their position by the unmistakable geometry of searchlight batteries arranged around Den Helder. Anti-aircraft fire reached upward half-heartedly, the gunners apparently judging that Arthur Roberts' obvious damage rendered additional violence unnecessary. The bomber crew felt the psychological weight lift slightly as they left occupied Europe behind, though the North Sea ahead presented its own lethal challenges. Ward descended to 5,000 feet, balancing the need to conserve fuel through lower altitude against the reduced gliding distance if the engine failed. Hayes and Mitchell moved to ditching stations, preparing for the possibility that their aircraft would become a submarine before reaching England. Cooper remained in his turret, still isolated, still vigilant, still tracking the empty sky for threats that had already done their worst. The North Sea unrolled beneath them like hammered pewter under the winter moon, surface textured by white-capped waves that promised death to any aircraft forced to alight upon them. Ward held R4 Robert at 4,800 feet, an altitude chosen through grim calculation high enough to glide perhaps 15 miles if the engine quit, low enough to stretch their fuel by reducing the work required from their overtaxed Pegasus engine. The bomber's single propeller carved through frigid air with a sound that had become hypnotic, a drone that filled their heads and made conversation difficult, even without the damaged intercom. Mitchell, having exhausted his duties with inoperative radio equipment, stationed himself at a window to watch for the engine fire that would announce their final crisis. The port engine's temperature gauge crept upward with troubling steadiness, climbing past normal operating range into the amber zone that indicated stress. Ward enriched the fuel mixture slightly, sacrificing economy for cooling, buying time measured in minutes against the finite fuel in their tanks. Behind him, Barnes worked through his navigation calculations for the third time, seeking errors that might explain why his dead reckoning indicated they should have sighted the English coast 15 minutes earlier. His mathematics revealed no mistakes, which suggested either his fundamental assumptions about wind and drift were wrong, or they were precisely where his calculations indicated above empty ocean, further from land than their fuel would permit them to reach. He chose not to share this conclusion with Ward, reasoning that no benefit came from confirming what the pilot surely already suspected. At 1:37 in the morning, Hayes spotted the searchlight batteries of Great Yarmouth, their beams sweeping the coast in vigilant patterns against German intruders. The sight produced a collective exhalation from the crew. That moment when men who have held their breath against fate finally permit themselves to believe in survival. Ward altered course to parallel the coastline, tracking southward toward Suffolk while remaining over land where emergency landing sites existed. The engine temperature gauge now resided firmly in the red zone, but Ward judged they possessed perhaps 30 minutes of operation remaining sufficient to reach Newmarket if no additional complications arose. This optimism lasted exactly 9 minutes, until the engine began producing irregular surges that indicated fuel starvation or contamination from damaged lines. The bomber lurched and shuddered as power fluctuated wildly, altitude bleeding away in 100-foot increments despite Ward's attempts to compensate. Barnes abandoned his navigation station and joined Mitchell at the windows, both men scanning the darkness below for the distinctive pattern of airfield lights that would indicate Newmarket. Military airfields maintained blackout conditions, but they could be persuaded to illuminate their runways for returning aircraft if those aircraft possessed functioning radios to request assistance. Arthur Robert possessed no such capability, its wireless equipment reduced to shrapnel-punctured wreckage. Ward fired the recognition flares that identified them as friendly, cascading colored stars that announced their presence to the anti-aircraft batteries below, and, hopefully, to their home airfield's watch officers. The response came at 1:53. Newmarket's runway lights blazed into existence, twin rows of illumination that carved a path through the darkness like a celestial highway. Ward had never seen anything more beautiful than those lights. Though he recognized they represented merely the opportunity to attempt survival rather than survival itself, Arthur Roberts' hydraulic system, damaged beyond function, meant their landing gear would not extend normally. The undercarriage could be lowered by emergency hand cranks, but that process required time they might not possess with an engine threatening to seize at any moment. Ward made his choice instantly. Wheels up, landing on the grass beside the runway, where soft earth would absorb their momentum more gently than pavement and where they would not block the runway for other aircraft that might require emergency landing. Ward brought R for Robert around in a wide, gentle turn that honored the aircraft's battered condition. Losing altitude gradually as he aligned with the grass strip adjacent to Newmarket's main runway, the engine coughed once, twice, then resumed its laboring rhythm, a mechanical heart struggling against injury to maintain life for just a few minutes more. Hayes and Mitchell braced themselves in crash positions while Barnes made his way aft to retrieve Cooper from the isolated tail turret, manually releasing the locked doors and finding the rear gunner still at his post, still tracking the sky, unaware that their ordeal approached its conclusion. The 5 men exchanged no words. Exhaustion and cold had reduced them to creatures of pure function, operating on training and determination alone. At 1:58, Ward cut the throttle and flared R for Robert for its final landing. The bomber settled toward Earth with a grinding shriek as its belly contacted grass, the geodetic framework flexing but holding as the aircraft skidded forward in a cascade of sparks and torn vegetation. The metal skin of the fuselage, already perforated by hundreds of holes, crumpled further as they decelerated, but the essential structure maintained integrity. They slid for 300 yards before momentum bled away, and R for Robert lurched to a halt, canted slightly to port, wreathed in steam from its overheated engine. For a long moment no one moved. Then Ward reached up and shut down the electrical systems, completing the final checklist item of a flight that had become legend before they had even emerged from their aircraft. Ground crew swarmed the bomber within minutes, arriving in trucks with fire extinguishers and medical personnel who found 5 stunned but essentially uninjured men climbing from the wreckage. What they discovered when they began examining R for Robert produced gasps of disbelief that quickly spread through the assembled personnel. In the growing light of dawn on Christmas Eve, as the last of Bomber Command's aircraft returned from the Munster raid, Ground Crew Chief Flight Sergeant William Reynolds conducted a preliminary damage assessment that would later become part of official RAF records. He began counting the visible damaged shell holes, shrapnel impacts, torn metal, and quickly lost track of individual strikes as the numbers climbed beyond 50, then beyond 100. Reynolds organized his team into a systematic survey, dividing the aircraft into sections and assigning each man a segment to catalog. They worked through the morning, marking each point of damage with chalk, photographing the destruction, and compiling lists that grew to absurd lengths. According to documentation preserved in the Imperial War Museum's archives and later cited in numerous historical analyses of bomber command operations, the final tally exceeded 207 distinct impacts. 20mm cannon shells had struck the wings, fuselage, and tail assembly. Shrapnel from proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells had peppered the underside. Machine gun rounds had stitched patterns across the fabric-covered surfaces. Yet the geodetic construction had distributed these injuries across its lattice framework, preventing any single strike from proving catastrophic. The German pilot who had attacked R for Robert had unknowingly participated in a brutal test of Barnes-Wallace's engineering philosophy. Each strike that failed to bring down the Wellington validated Wallace's conviction that redundancy and load distribution offered better survival than concentrated strength. Conventional aircraft construction placed critical structural members in specific locations. Damaging those members ensured destruction. The geodetic design eliminated critical single points, creating instead a web where damage to any element merely shifted stress to its neighbors. This mathematical elegance, invisible during normal operations, became starkly apparent when rendered visible by German ammunition. As Christmas Day dawned over Newmarket, Reynolds submitted his preliminary report to Squadron Leader Ward, who had managed perhaps 3 hours of sleep before returning to examine his aircraft. The ground crew chief's conclusion was simultaneously professional and incredulous. R for Robert would fly again, possibly within days, certainly within the week. The geodetic framework remained fundamentally sound despite its wounds. Replacement fabric could be stretched over the damaged surfaces. New hydraulic lines could be run where old ones had been severed. The engines, though stressed, had not been damaged beyond normal wear. By the afternoon of the 24th, engineering crews had already begun the restoration, working through the holiday to return their wounded bomber to operational status. The restoration of R for Robert became a technical challenge that transformed into a matter of squadron pride. Reynolds assembled his most experienced fitters, riggers, and electricians, assigning them shifts that ensured round-the-clock work despite the Christmas holiday. The first task involved stripping away all damaged fabric covering to expose the geodetic framework beneath the process that revealed the full extent of the structural damage while simultaneously confirming Reynolds' assessment that the fundamental airframe remained sound. Dozens of the basket-weave metal strips that formed the Wellington's internal structure bore dents, gouges, and even complete fractures, yet the load had redistributed across adjacent members, exactly as Vallis had predicted in his pre-war calculations. The engineering team documented each repair with obsessive precision, creating technical drawings that would later inform modifications to subsequent Wellington variants. Where individual geodetic members had fractured, they fabricated replacement sections from aluminum stock, drilling out rivets and splicing in new material with techniques that bordered on metalworking artistry. The process required patience that military urgency rarely permitted, but Reynolds insisted on proper procedure, for Robert would return to operational status only when restored to airworthiness standards that would satisfy the Air Ministry's most stringent inspectors. This meticulous approach meant that by the evening of the 25th, they had completed perhaps 20% of the necessary structural repairs, with the hydraulic and electrical systems still awaiting attention. The hydraulic restoration presented particular challenges, as the German cannon fire had severed lines in multiple locations, while simultaneously contaminating the system with metal fragments. Reynolds' hydraulic specialist, Corporal James Mackenzie, spent 8 hours on the 26th, methodically flushing and replacing every section of hydraulic tubing, testing each repair under pressure before moving to the next. He discovered that one shell fragment, no larger than a thumbnail, had lodged in the landing gear actuator mechanism. Had it shifted position during flight, it might have jammed the gear in a partially deployed state, creating drag that would have exhausted their remaining fuel over the North Sea. The discovery reinforced the crew's growing awareness that they had survived not merely through skill, but through a succession of minor miracles. According to technical records later preserved in the RAF Henlow archives and referenced in post-war analyses of bomber maintenance procedures, the most time-consuming aspect of R. for Roberts' restoration involved the electrical system. The Wellington's wiring ran throughout the fuselage in bundles that German ammunition had treated as convenient targets. Mitchell, who possessed electrical training beyond his wireless operator qualifications, volunteered to assist the ground crew electricians in tracing damaged circuits. They worked in the bomber's interior by flashlight, following wire bundles through the geodetic framework, splicing breaks and replacing sections where insulation had been destroyed. On the 27th, they energized the system for the first time and immediately discovered a short circuit that blew the main fuse problem that required another 6 hours to isolate and repair. The fabric covering presented less technical difficulty, but consumed tremendous labor. Riggers stretched Irish linen over the repaired framework sections, a process requiring strength and precision as they pulled the material taut before treating it with dope that would shrink and seal the fabric. The distinctive smell of aircraft dope, a chemical cocktail that preserved and waterproofed the linen, filled the hangar and lingered on the workers' clothing long after their shifts ended. By the evening of the 28th, R4 Robert had begun to resemble an operational aircraft again, though it bore scars in the form of fabric patches that covered the most extensive damage. Reynolds insisted on painting these patches to match the bomber's camouflage scheme, maintaining the professional standards that defined his approach to aircraft maintenance. On the morning of the 29th of December, Ward arrived at the hangar to find Reynolds and his team standing beside R4 Robert, their work complete. The bomber gleamed under the hangar lights, its patches and repairs visible upon close inspection, but not detracting from its overall airworthiness. Reynolds presented Ward with a technical report documenting every repair, every test, every component that had been replaced or restored. The ground crew chief's conclusion was unequivocal. R4 Robert was ready to return to operations, subject to successful completion of an air test that would verify all systems under flight conditions. Ward accepted the report and conducted his own walk-around inspection, noting the care evident in every repair. The test flight was scheduled for 1400 hours that afternoon, allowing sufficient daylight to conduct thorough systems checks while maintaining the option to return before darkness complicated any potential issues. Ward assembled his original crew barns, Hayes, Mitchell, and Cooper, reasoning that the men who had brought R4 Robert home possessed both the experience to evaluate its restored capabilities and the right to participate in its return to service. They arrived at the aircraft 30 minutes early, conducting their own pre-flight inspections with particular attention to the areas that had sustained the most severe damage. Cooper climbed into the rear turret and rotated it through its full range of motion, finding the hydraulics responsive despite the trauma they had absorbed. At 13:55, Ward fired up both engines, listening intently to their sound for any indication of mechanical distress. The Pegasus engines caught immediately, settling into their familiar rhythm without hesitation. He advanced the throttles methodically, checking magnetos, testing controls, confirming that every gauge responded appropriately. Reynolds stood at the hangar entrance, watching with the fierce pride of a craftsman whose work faced its definitive test. When Ward signaled his readiness for taxi, ground crew removed the wheel chocks, and R for Robert rolled forward under its own power for the first time since its emergency landing 6 days earlier. The takeoff run commenced at 1400 hours precisely, Ward pushing the throttles forward smoothly while monitoring engine temperatures and pressures. R4 Robert accelerated down Newmarket's runway with increasing speed. The slight shimmy in the landing gear that Ward remembered from before the Munster mission unchanged, a quirk of this particular aircraft that had survived everything the Luftwaffe could inflict. At 65 miles per hour, Ward eased back on the control column, and the bomber lifted into the afternoon sky, climbing steadily while Ward cycled through his systems checks. Every control surface responded correctly, every instrument indicated normal operation, every system functioned exactly as designed. The repairs had been executed flawlessly. For 45 minutes, Ward put R for Robert through increasingly demanding maneuvers. Testing its limits without exceeding safety margins, he climbed to 8,000 feet and throttled back to simulate single-engine flight. Confirming that the bomber maintained altitude and directivity despite losing 50% of its power. He executed steep turns, deployed and retracted the landing gear multiple times, and generally subjected the aircraft to stresses that would reveal any weakness in Reynolds's restoration. The bomber performed without complaint, responding to Ward's inputs with the familiar precision that had kept them alive over Germany. As he turned on to final approach back at Newmarket, Ward keyed his radio and transmitted a simple message: R4 Robert is operational. The evening of the 29th of December, 1942, found R4 Robert secured in its dispersal area, refueled, rearmed, and loaded with bombs for that night's operations. Squadron 75's operations board listed it among the aircraft assigned to attack railway yards at Duisburg, a mission that would take them once more into German airspace, less than a week after their near destruction over Munster. Ward gathered his crew for briefing, noting their quiet satisfaction at returning to operations in the same aircraft that had brought them home against impossible odds. This continuity mattered to bomber crews, who developed superstitious attachments to aircraft that demonstrated the will to survive. R for Robert had earned their trust in the most definitive way possible. According to operational records maintained in the National Archives at Kew, and subsequently analyzed in numerous historical studies of bomber command effectiveness, R for Robert flew its mission to Duisburg that night without incident, dropping its bombs on target and returning to Newmarket with only minor flak damage that required minimal repair. The bomber would go on to complete another 63 operational sorties before being retired from frontline service in August of 1943, having survived challenges that destroyed aircraft of supposedly superior construction. Its longevity validated not only Barnes-Wallace's engineering genius, but also the skill of ground crews like Reynolds's team, who transformed wrecked aircraft into operational bombers through expertise and determination. The story of R4 Robert's survival became part of Squadron 75's unofficial history, repeated in mess halls and dispersal huts as evidence that skill and luck could overcome statistical certainty. The more than 200 bullet and shell impacts represented a catalog of near misses, each one potentially fatal but collectively insufficient to defeat the Wellington's redundant design. German intelligence officers, had they known the full details, would have been forced to recalculate their assessments of the Wellington's vulnerability. The bomber they believed they had destroyed had instead returned to attack them again within a week, an outcome that spoke to both British resilience and the limitations of current German anti-aircraft effectiveness. Ward and his crew completed their operational tours in March of 1943. Having survived 30 missions that claimed the lives of 43% of Bomber Command aircrew who began operations during the same period, they were decorated with distinguished flying crosses and returned to training duties, passing their hard-won knowledge to the next generation of bomber crews who would prosecute the strategic air campaign into 1944 and 1945. In post-war interviews, Ward consistently attributed their survival primarily to R. for Roberts' construction, secondarily to Reynolds's restoration skills, and only tertiarily to his own airmanship, a characteristically modest assessment that understated his contribution while acknowledging the material realities that enabled survival. The geodetic Wellington design remained in production through 1945. With 11,461 examples built before the type was finally retired from RAF service in the early 1950s, modern aviation historians recognize the Wellington as one of the most successful bomber designs of the Second World War. Its geodetic construction providing survivability that conventional designs could not match. The specific story of R. for Robert and its 200-plus bullet impacts became emblematic of the type's resilience, cited in technical analyses and historical accounts as definitive proof that Barnes-Wallace's unconventional engineering philosophy had been vindicated under the harshest possible conditions. The bomber that the Luftwaffe counted as destroyed had instead become a symbol of the defiant spirit that characterized bomber command throughout the war, damaged, patched, and immediately returned to the battle that would ultimately decide the fate of Europe.